Hello, everyone, and welcome to Creative Live. Welcome to Creative Live TV. I'm your host, Kenna Klosterman, and we are here doing a live recording of another episode of our podcast, We Are Photographers, where we connect you with photographers and filmmakers all over the world who are making waves in the industry and making changes for the world. Again, if you are watching us on creativelive.com/TV, you can join in the conversation. You can click on the chat icon that's up on the top right-hand corner. I will see your comments. We always love to start with shout-outs, so let me know where it is that you are tuning in from all over the world. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, you can share the conversation out by retweeting, sharing on Facebook. We love to get as many people live in the conversation as we can. So once again, I am thrilled today to have my guest, Daniella Zalcman. Daniella is a documentary photographer. She is the founder and director of Women Photograph, which is an initiative working to elevate the voices of women and non-binary visual journalists. She is based between Paris and New York and is joining us right now from the south of France. She is a multiple grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a fellow with the International Women's Media Foundation, a National Geographic Society grantee. She is also a proud member of the Authority Collective and Diversify Photo. She is one of the co-authors of the Photo Bill of Rights, and I have seen her career is truly focused on advocacy, community organizing, and truly the education for the next generation to learn history of injustices globally that have been largely untold. And I can't wait to talk about all of these things and more. Welcome to the show, Daniella Zalcman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Daniella, I first of all, I'm a huge fan of the work that you do and in preparing more for this conversation, kind of diving even more into your work. I just don't know when you sleep. You travel around the world and you are doing so much incredible work, not just in a journalistic sense, but then again on the advocacy side, the community organizing side. So I have so many things that I want to talk with you about. But let's start with Women Photograph. And we're in a time now. It is July. It's July. It's August. What time is it? Where are we?
What
it's
year?
August.
Who knows?
I know. It's August 2020, and we are, in the midst still of the pandemic. We're also in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, and there is a lot of organizations that are getting seen more, even though they have been existing, that are helping elevate voices in the photography world, in the photojournalism world, and Women Photograph is one of them, and yet it's been around. And so I'm curious if you can tell us about the origins of it, why you founded it, and sort of some of the impact that you've seen over the years, and is there more now?
Sure. So I launched Women Photograph in February of 2017. I think I started working on it around July 2016, and the impetus really was sort of a buildup of my own rage at some of the hiring, assigning, publishing practices within my own industry. For a group of people who constitute more than 50% of the population, we only constitute roughly 15 to 20% of the working news photographer industry. And that represents a huge problem. And I, assume that most of the audience right now is aware of why exactly that's so toxic and so problematic. But, if we stop to consider that photojournalists have this amazing privilege and opportunity to show people places and people they'll never otherwise meet, it kind of means that effectively photojournalists show people how to see. And even though I think for a very long time journalists have kind of understood themselves or believed themselves to be these impartial, unbiased third-party observers, the truth is our identity and our experiences and everything about the way we have lived informs how we see and how we interact with the world. And so, if we do not have women documenting politics or sports or entertainment or anything in between, that becomes a real crisis. So Women Photograph is born out of the discontent and anger that I had about that pretty striking imbalance in my own business. And so it is now a private database, or sorry, both public and private database of more than 1,000 independent women and non-binary visual journalists. We're also a grant-making organization. We've given out over $150,000 in project grants over the past 3.5 years. We have an annual workshop that we hold that's focused on skills building. We have an annual mentorship program that's actually just about to open for applications. So generally speaking, we're both focused on trying to convince the industry that things need to change and provide resources to help move that along, and then also to provide resources to our community itself.
Well, that's what I think is so powerful about the what I see the work that you're doing in a number of areas is coming at it from both sides. So sort of advocating for the need for underrepresented voices to be hired, and so to the people that are hiring, but then also more education and resources for the people who are trying to be hired, and which is a lot to take on, sort of those both sides, but both being necessary for it to come together. Do you have any stories that you can share about individual people who have like success stories of because you've been doing this now for 3.5 years, that you've seen and that keeps the work going? I mean, it's the $150,000 in grants is incredible.
It's hard to sort of pinpoint. And do you mean in terms of institutional shift and individual editors who may have shifted their perspectives and their hiring practices?
Well, I mean, it can go different ways, but in terms of in institutional shifts for women and non-binary photographers, are there people that have, whose careers have been dramatically changed because of it? And then also, I guess, the institutional side as well.
I think it's hard for me individually or for Women Photograph to take credit for any individual's career. There are always so many things and so many resources and so many amazing people who give time and energy to help out, especially independent photographers, because that is so predicated on networking and who you know. But that is a central part of our mission, and a huge part of it is just the building of community. We have been running these workshops now for 3 years, and it was amazing. The first one we did outside of the United States was in December of 2018, and we managed to bring 50 photographers from around Latin America, from I think 19 different countries, to Ecuador for a workshop that we conducted entirely in Spanish. And we brought photo editors from the Washington Post and the Associated Press and the New York Times, who were all fluent Spanish speakers, and it was really incredible to feel like we were both sort of moving our programming internationally and also just realizing like these communities are here, these women photographers are here globally, and they just haven't necessarily had the spaces for community building in the past. So, helping to contribute to that and helping to build on the work of other people who have similar advocacy plans, I think is really crucial.
I mean, and you go back to, starting at the top about, about why is it that they're 15% of the industry. You hear kind of this statement of like, oh, I can't find female photographers or, non-white male photographers. And is that shifting?
Well, it has to, because it's not true anymore, right? I mean, that sentence literally was what inspired me to create Women Photograph. I was at a French photo festival and got into a slight altercation with a photo editor who said that. And so I literally went back to my Airbnb and started a Google form. But the truth is, if you are committed to doing the work and you recognize that our industry has a problem, there are now infinite resources out there. I mean, you referenced some of them, but between Diversify Photo and Natives Photograph and the Authority Collective and Black women photographers, there are just so many places where you can now go to find photographers who are new to you, who are in demographics that are historically underrepresented in the photojournalism space. So there isn't really a great excuse anymore, other than the fact that we've always done things this way and change is slow, but the resources are there, the lists are there. So, I think it's time that we start maybe using them a little more.
You mentioned earlier that field, journalism can often be about relationships and networks, and I'm and therefore providing opportunities to allow people to do that is so critical. And I'd love to kind of go back in time to your beginnings as a journalist, and 'cause I know that you in college you were working as for the Daily News in New York, and really started as a writer, and a photographer, and so can you talk about how that sort of on the ground journalism led to your kind of networking and careers in taking your career to where it is today?
Sure. So I think, I've probably wanted to be a journalist since I was 12, I think. And for me, that meant newspapers. And so I only applied to colleges in New York City because to me, that was sort of the center of the media world. And, I'm the child of a Vietnamese immigrant and the grandchild of 2 Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and my mother is an attorney and my father is a physician. And so like the whole being a journalist plan was not like super on their radar. So I studied
because you studied architecture, right?
So I studied architecture, which was sort of the best compromise I could make between like seemingly respectable and still kind of artsy, and gave me the time and space to go off and be a journalist. But the real first thing I did when I got to Columbia was I joined my student newspaper. That was number one task. And then I immediately started trying to figure out how to just be a working journalist. And so I was really lucky. I had a series of amazing breaks, and I started freelancing pretty much full time for the New York Daily News when I was 19, skipping many of my classes and not being a phenomenal student. But, I had figured out what I wanted to do, and I was just going to do it.
I think that I feel like just in observing what you have created and continue to create, like you seem like you are a person that you see an opportunity, you see what you want to do, and you just go for it. Was that in your growing up? Was that from your family, like the work ethic? Were you always that way as a kid?
I don't know if I was always that way, but it's definitely genetic. My mother came to the United States by herself as an immigrant from Vietnam in 1968, very shortly before the Tet Offensive. She went on to become the first Vietnamese prosecutor at the Department of Justice. She's a pretty formidable woman, so I think some degree of that determination and grit is definitely in my DNA. And I was also just really passionate about journalism and this completely different way of relating to society and a different way of telling stories and educating. So I think from the beginning, I was the editor of my middle school literary magazine and the editor of my high school newspaper, and was just completely sold.
And so this evolution, I was looking at your Instagram feed, and you are teaching class via main media virtually right now. Alternative storytelling, allowing the story to guide the process. And I kind of want to dive into a little bit. There's the sort of alternative storytelling. I didn't know if you meant alternative media, but then because some of the work that you do is different than just straight up back to Daily News, photojournalism, covering stories of the day. And then there's this aspect of allowing the story to guide the process. So can you talk a little bit about like just at a high level, what that kind of class is and what you're hoping your students will achieve, but then let's start with that. And then I want to talk about allowing the story to guide the process with some of your work too.
Sure. Well, and so I started out, I probably spent the first 5 years of my career as a very traditional newspaper photographer, maybe in one of the most traditional formats of our industry, at a tabloid, which is how I learned how to, I never studied photography, I never studied journalism. The New York Daily News taught me how to be a photojournalist, for better or for worse. And then I worked more or less full-time for the Wall Street Journal after that, and had a lot of readjusting and learning I also had to do there to make sure I wasn't bringing some of my worst tabloid practices with me. But after about 5 years of that, I realized that as much as I loved the medium, as much as I loved what I was doing, as a person, and I think my strength as a photojournalist is really that I'm a deep empath. I am great at sitting down with someone and just completely getting to the bottom of their life story. People inherently trust me and want to share with me. And there's something a little bit exhausting about going through sort of the daily shift cycle of a newspaper where you get 2 hours on a single story and then you have to file and then move on to the next assignment. And I was realizing as time passed, I want to be able to spend weeks or months or maybe even years on the stories that matter to me, not this constant frenetic, here are 8 stories that you need to make sure you cover today and call us in the morning and we'll give you another 8. And so in sort of the process of figuring out how to shift, do my own grant-funded, long-form, self-guided projects, I also started thinking about, okay, what are the ways in which photography as a medium doesn't always serve the story? And what are some other ways in which we can think about what photography can do if we're not necessarily constrained by what we consider traditional photography? And so, I recognize, especially early on, I think some of my photo editors were suspicious and or horrified by some of the things that I was doing, which is totally their prerogative. And is, I completely understand why on many levels they said, this doesn't work for us. This is not journalism. But to me, visual storytelling is just that. It's about the story. It's about the people who trust us with their time and their narratives. And as long as we are respecting that above all else, as long as we're being ethical and transparent in the ways in which we share what we've learned, I think there don't necessarily need to be limitations on some of the technical ways in which we make those images. So I think a lot of my work since then has definitely towed the line of what many more traditional people consider journalism.
And I think I think it's interesting. I've heard you say and I don't care if people think it's traditional journalism or not. As long as you know that you are holding yourself accountable to these photojournalistic ethical standards. And so I want to let people talk about your incredible long-term project, Signs of Your Identity. And I've been diving into it, researching, we're now in a time of really now more people being aware of unlearning history. Yet this has been your focus with this story for years. Can you tell us about the project?
Sure. So in 2014, I ended up at the International AIDS Conference in Melbourne. And I was there with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. They had backed a long-term body of work in Uganda, completely unrelated. And I was looking for another project to work on while I was there, and I happened upon this UN AIDS report that referenced the fact that First Nations Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, have one of the fastest growing rates of HIV of any group of people in the world. And from a public health perspective, that made no sense to me. And so I wrote a grant application and I spent a month driving around 3 provinces in Canada. And almost every single person I met told me about their time in something called Indian residential school. And I had never heard of this system before. It was not part of my formal education. It was not something I'd ever come across in sort of mainstream documentation of US or Canadian history. But starting in the 1870s, the Canadian government created a network of boarding schools that were made mandatory by law and effectively forcibly removed young Indigenous children from their families and their communities and sent them off to these boarding schools where the stated mission was to assimilate them into the dominant Western culture. And often that was through violent physical abuse, where children were punished if they spoke their languages or practiced any form of their culture. There was a lot of sexual assault. There was medical testing performed on young children. There was mass sterilization of young women. These awful things happened in these schools. And we tend to think about the history of the oppression of Indigenous people in North America, and we think about things that happened hundreds of years ago. And yet the last one of these schools in Canada closed in 1996. And so in the meantime, I'm in Canada reporting on what I think is a public health story and learning about this massive chapter of Canadian history where at the time there were 80,000 living survivors still of this boarding school system, and realizing, oh my God, I cannot imagine something this huge, this much a part of our collective experience and history and identity that has just never been talked about. And so I've effectively been working on a long-term project on that story since in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, and potentially in many more countries, because it's an idea, sort of this notion of coercive assimilation through basically kidnapping and forcibly and violently educating young Indigenous children has happened pretty much everywhere in the world.
It is truly shocking, and 80,000 living survivors in something and that was just in Canada, and those and in something that we don't even know or hear about, which is unfortunately far too many pieces of history, and like you said, the generational trauma that has far-reaching impacts, and so can you talk a little bit about how you went about telling the stories, because you're using these double exposures, at length interviews with people, and again how that story, the process of telling the stories evolved, and how that has impacted the project.
So, I referenced the public health part of the story because some of the first images that I ever took that I thought were part of the story were looking at the ways in which HIV is transmitted among Indigenous communities in Canada, and that in urban spaces is primarily through injection drug use and the opioid crisis. So I spent a month in Saskatchewan and British Columbia and Ontario, and I got home with a portfolio of images that mostly were depicting injection drug use. And many of the people I photographed were people in whose homes I was staying, who were incredibly open and kind, and were also, sort of simultaneously giving me access to their lives, but also educating me about their own family histories and about Indigenous history in Canada. And it hit me when I got home that I couldn't publish any of those photographs, that it would be fundamentally irresponsible, that they were not good journalism, that they weren't going to help anyone understand the things that I was just starting to really learn about. You referenced intergenerational trauma, and that's really something that we have only just started to talk about, much less discuss with school-age children. And so I ended up going back to the funder, to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and saying, hey guys, I'm so sorry, I screwed up. I thought this thing was the story, but it was actually just a tiny bit of this much bigger story. I need to go back and do it again. I'm so sorry, can you please give me more money? And luckily, we had a good enough rapport, and they trusted me, and they allowed me to do that, which one of the many reasons why I'm so grateful to work in very slow ways, because it allows you to mess up and to correct those mistakes before they're codified and solidified in publications. But I went back and I decided that I was going to photograph survivors of the boarding school system, interview them about their memories and their experiences, and then based on those conversations, I would go in search of secondary images, usually around the sites of where they had attended boarding school, and then create these composites, these double exposure portraits of each individual.
And so that the signs of, just going back to the title, the signs of your identity, being so many layers. Can you talk about even like the title? Sure.
So the title actually comes from, and I have slight reservations about this now, that it actually comes from the words of, one of the perpetrators of this horrible system. But the first official apology in Canada was from, I believe his name was Archbishop Michael Piers, who was the head of the, I'm going to get this wrong because it's been a while since I've said this, but I believe he was the Archbishop of the Presbyterian Church, but that may be incorrect. There were 3 different churches that helped run the system. And in his official apology, he said that, I'm so sorry that we took from you the signs of your identity. And that struck me when I read it for the first time, because that's exactly what the system did, intentionally and maliciously, was trying to rob young Indigenous children of their connection to their culture and create a generational divide between them and their parents and their grandparents, to help. And that system is now referred to as cultural genocide, and that's effectively what it accomplished, was destroying languages, breaking ties between generations of Indigenous people.
It is astounding, and I think then that the tell me about how you then were able to get it into a book, and then the sort of there's uncovering the story, and then there's using it to enable change, and I've seen you a focus on education. You speak to high school students. So how has this been able to then evolve as an educational tool?
So I published a book of the work from Canada in 2017 with a small publisher called Photo Evidence. They focus on sort of human rights focused photojournalism. They're amazing. And the Pulitzer Center actually helped me buy half of the print run, and we distributed those books for free to educators throughout Canada and the United States. Because at the time, this is starting to change in Canada, not so much in America, where we actually invented the boarding school system. At the time, there was almost no curriculum around boarding schools. And, the book itself, it's minimal, but it's 25 survivors, their portraits, and then interview excerpts. So it can be used as a primary source for teachers who do want to start broaching the subject with their students. And then I've also assembled a website that has sort of supplementary additional educational resources as well.
You call yourself, or I think maybe it's on your Twitter line, a Western imperialism correspondent, which is not a term I'd heard before. But again, like the focus of multiple of your projects. Another one that struck me as I was looking through your Instagram feed was this for you. It was published by Smithsonian, but the artist Dred Scott and this slave rebellion reenactment of staging the 1811 German Coast Uprising, which was the largest revolt of enslaved people in U.S. history. Can you tell us about how, again, like photographing and working with somebody who is creating such a project has changed how photography can change people's view of their knowledge of the world and history?
And I think both Dred and I are very much working in that vein of thinking about what are the histories that have been left out. And that is something that absolutely guides my work and frames my work. I mean, the Western imperialism correspondent is a joke, but it's also true, right? Western colonization effectively controlled almost the entire planet, and we almost never frame our understanding of our political and social and economic systems through that lens. We never really think about the longstanding consequences that are still influencing policy and penal codes that were left behind by the British, and all these other things that still deeply impact how we see ourselves, how we see other people. And Dred's work is very similar, and something that he said to me when I was working on that piece was, look, we talk about slavery, but how often did we learn about slave uprisings?
Yeah.
In history classes, they were constant, right? They were any time you have a group of people who are being oppressed, there is constant fighting back. And why have we suppressed those narratives of the people who were fighting back? And we actually were part of a grantee cohort for Open Society Foundations a few years ago, so I'd sort of been present at the very start of the development of this idea, and I just really knew that I wanted to photograph it because in a entirely different world, I'd photographed for years World War II reenactors in the UK, and there's something about the act of reenactment that I find fascinating and powerful, and this embodying of the past for people who are fundamentally just nerds who really just love digging into the intricacies and the details and the actions of ancestors of people who came before. And then just, combined with the conversations that we're having more and more in the United States about who are we as Americans? What does it mean for us to recognize that the United States is a country built on stolen land with slave labor? What happens when we can actually fully recognize that? And a lot of my work so far has been looking at Indigenous history and the things that we have forgotten or willfully erased in Indigenous history. And so I'm grateful. Obviously, I am not Black. I'm not Indigenous. I think it's very complicated for me as an outsider to be covering many of these narratives. But I also think partially it's my responsibility as an American to be reminding people there are things that we willfully forget, and we need to make sure that we are incorporating them into our understanding of who we are.
How does your Vietnamese heritage impact your desire to work in this way as well?
I mean, the Western imperialism correspondent thing is definitely a byproduct of that. I grew up again with a very strong, smart mom, but who constantly went on about how, the Vietnamese fought off 1,000 years of Chinese invasion, and they fought off the French, and they fought off the Americans, and so, God damn it, we managed to beat all our colonizers. And so, I always felt that framing in terms of my own identity, and then felt this gaping chasm when I was in school of, wait, why are we not talking about Britain's role as a colonizer? Why are we not talking about our own role as a colonizing power? Because even though we don't see ourselves as being part of that era, we absolutely have committed the exact same atrocities, whether it's for land or resources or enslaving humans. And so I think just making sure that we remember the roots of what those power structures do has just always been a huge part of the way I see the world.
It's I want to talk about some of the other things that you work on as well. Just again, because of this, just to build awareness of the hard work that is being done to make changes. Can you tell us about the Photo Bill of Rights that you were a co-author on, because I want to raise awareness for what that is, as that's fairly new, and why you got involved with that.
Yeah, so a colleague, I think at sort of the very beginning of the pandemic becoming real in the United States, wrote to a series of people who are all involved in these sort of affinity organizations that are all doing advocacy work, the Authority Collective, Color Positive, Diversify Photo, and said, we have to do something. And, it started out as, maybe it's an open letter, but part of it was really based around freelancers just being completely stripped of dignity in a lot of the interactions they were having with editors, where they were not being offered hazard pay or PPE. They were being just treated terribly, essentially. And so it came out of this sense of, okay, like we need to build some guidelines. A huge percentage of our industry now is freelance. We don't have the benefit of unions. We don't have any HR departments. We don't really have any protections. And now there are so many of us. I don't know if this is true, but I would venture to guess that at this point, a majority of working photojournalists are independent. And so it was just this sense of, okay, let's get together and try to come up with some way to say, look, we need to protect each other. We need to be kinder and more responsible and more ethical in the ways we treat each other within this business. And so we started working on something that then became a little bigger and turned into a Bill of Rights. And then George Floyd was murdered. And so then all of a sudden we saw the ways in which the press was working in Minnesota and the ways in which mainstream media outlets were covering the Black Lives Matter movements, and just all of these different things sort of coalesced and intersected to turn into the document that we ended up publishing in June or July, sometime in the past 6 weeks. It's been a blur, but it's fundamentally rooted in wanting both the hiring bodies that are paying and publishing independent photographers and also photographers in the field to govern themselves with the most ethical standards possible, to treat their colleagues well, to be treated well themselves in negotiations with employers. It's really a document that is hoping for the best in our industry. And we all see a lot of gaps and flaws right now in how we're treated, how we treat each other, how we treat the people we photograph. So this is an attempt to start remedying some of that.
Can you talk a little bit about, just how we treat each other, how we treat the people that we photograph? Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of maybe some experiences that you've had in terms of, because I know, again, a lot of these things that you, when it's advocacy, it's because they're injustices. And so are there experiences that you can share that as a female photojournalist that kind of have been driving forces for you?
Yeah, as a woman photographer, I think many, I won't say all, but I think most women photographers, especially when they're starting out, are subjected to an insane level of sexual harassment and even assault in the field. That is, and I think there was maybe even a time when that was considered a rite of passage. And I still sometimes hear from older generations that that's what we had to go through, and that's just the way things are. And I'd like to think that we can all work to build something better and less toxic. But that is part of the problem of there being so few women working in news photography, is that you're one of very few. I remember when I was starting, Mayor Bloomberg would constantly make fun of me at City Hall press conferences because I would be the only female photographer there on a regular basis. And so that left me open to just constant terrible comments from my male colleagues. From my second ever assignment, I was covering New York Fashion Week, and a wire stringer, I won't name the outlet, had taken over the spot that was assigned to me and to the Daily News. And he said, well, I'll move my bag if you kiss me. And this was in front of 40 colleagues. And I just, as a 19-year-old at the time, I was just like, how do I navigate this? I have no idea. And so I think, for me, one of the best things to come out of Women Photograph is that there's a community. There is a place where people can go to if they are confused or angry or need resources for negotiating contracts, or have had an editor do something completely out of line, that they can turn to a group of people and say, hey, what do I do? Because I wish I'd had that person when I was starting out, and I'm sure that person existed, but as someone who didn't come into the industry through sort of a traditional path, I didn't know where to find that person. So knowing that there are spaces, and there are many of them, again, all these other organizations I've mentioned, knowing that those spaces exist, I think is really critical.
I mean, it's appalling. And that's one horrible story, as you said, of and the fact that that's a rite of passage is appalling. And I'm curious then on the side of the ethics side then of staying true to the people that you are covering, and can you speak to that a little bit, and was there a moment where you learned, had an experience where I guess you talked about it a little bit in your Signs of Identity project, but what does that mean for you?
I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that photojournalism remains a very privileged profession. It is not something that anyone can just stumble into, because you have to make a huge financial investment to buy gear just to be able to even start to try to be a photojournalist. If you graduate from university with a ton of student debt, starting out as a freelancer and taking all those financial risks is not a particularly appealing idea. So, a pretty significant percentage of people who become photojournalists have some degree of economic privilege, have some kind of safety net, whether it's generational or otherwise. And that's a huge problem. That means that we have massive blind spots in our industry. It's also an industry that historically has been overwhelmingly white and Western and male. And so that means that when we are trying to tell stories in the global South, in communities of color, in the United States, in pretty much anywhere, that, again, we have these massive blind spots. We don't have necessarily the insider perspective, the historical context, the nuance. And, as I mentioned before with Signs of Your Identity, we make huge mistakes when we don't have those things, when we don't understand the full context of the places in which we're reporting. And that's not to say that we can't do that responsibly and respectfully as outsiders, but more often than not, especially early on in the profession, we got things wrong, and who was going to hold us accountable? Because we have more power. We have, especially pre-social media, pre-internet, we would walk away, and I say we, obviously, to mean photojournalists, not myself, but we would leave a city, a country, a community having photographed as we wished. And then there was absolutely no way in which those people could have any feedback in how we portrayed them and how their stories were told. And that's a huge problem. I think there are still little lingering relics of that time of, we have all of these sort of newspaper style ethics where we say we can't allow people to see images before they're published. And, on some level, I understand the pragmatic reasons for why that is. But also, I want to make sure that the people I'm photographing believe that they are being accurately and respectfully portrayed in what I'm doing. And, I think a lot of the misunderstanding that has come from the Photo Bill of Rights is that there are a lot of photographers who, for instance, work in the White House. And so, there's this spectrum of power that we all exist on. And some photographers spend their entire career speaking truth to power and photographing presidents and senators and congresspeople. And so that's great. That's one thing. And I'm less concerned about how they are thinking about power dynamics in their photography. But for people like me and conflict photographers and photographers who purport to be covering humanitarian crises, we have to absolutely think about the power imbalance in our positionality in a situation, in a country, in a community, and what it means that we have significantly more, whether it's economic or racial or cultural privilege compared to the people we're documenting. And so I think that's just a conversation that we are only beginning to broach and only beginning to understand.
And it kind of comes down to who is the work for? And who is it serving, and so having those conversations and building that awareness is a start. You talked about yourself being an empath, and I'm curious how empath, feeling other people's feelings and working on such devastating stories. How do you, you seem like such a strong woman. Like, how do you process this type of work?
It's funny, I get this question a lot, and part of me hates it because I want to say it's not about me and my experience compared to the experience of the people that I interview is nothing. And so I simultaneously, I want to pull back from that, but I do think, a lot of journalists are very bad at talking about their secondary trauma and their PTSD. And so it is important that we have open conversations about it. It's complicated. I am a person who absorbs the stories that people tell me pretty deeply. And I think it's what makes me good at my job and good at listening to people and understanding what they're telling me. But it's also a problem. After I worked on that first chapter of Signs of Your Identity, I genuinely became an alcoholic for a while when I got home. And it's hard. You have to figure out how to take care of yourself. I'm not always great at that. I work myself round the clock and I don't always make time for self-care. And I think, journalists need to be conscientious and aware that they need to do that. But again, I think it's another thing that we are starting to destigmatize. We are starting to have real conversations about moral injury and what it means to witness or even secondhand hear about horrible human rights atrocities and how that impacts individuals. And so I'm glad that we are now able to have nuanced, complicated conversations about those things, and that it's not something that, you're a wimp or that you're not good at your job or you're somehow lesser if you are susceptible. But yeah, I shy away from answering it myself. But, I hope that we all are better at taking care of ourselves too, because we can't do our jobs if we don't.
Well, it's interesting as the word strong woman came out of my mouth, and I was like, I felt myself being like, well, why do we have to be, what is this word strong, even mean?
And that's one of my biggest problems with, I think there is this huge generational divide right now among women in the industry, and it makes me really sad because I think part of it is women who came before saying, look, you have no idea what it was like for us and what we dealt with. And that is totally true. I cannot imagine what it was like for working photographers who are 30, 40, 50 years my senior, the level of horrifying behavior that they had to witness and just suffer through. But at the same time, I can also want my colleagues and photographers who come after me to not have those experiences. And I think it's unfortunate that a part of our industry has kind of codified this like tough characteristic that like women have to be tough and have to be one of the boys, and we have to be able to drink as hard, and we have to be able to do all these things in order to do our work. And I absolutely did that when I was starting out, and most of my colleagues did that when we were starting out. But I also want there to be room for someone who is very soft and gentle and delicate and not that to do their work too, because we need all of those different perspectives. And I think that's still something we're trying to work through, that we create this archetype of what a cool war photographer is supposed to look like, and no one else really fits the mold. But again, we're moving in the right direction. We're becoming more nuanced in our conversations.
Is that part of the conversation that is had in Women Photograph and in the workshops and the, there's is that part of that?
Yeah, I think so. And it's one of the benefits of having conversations in all women and non-binary spaces, is where you feel a little more comfortable sort of digging into those conversations when men aren't in the room, because no one wants to have to admit in front of male colleagues, well, I don't want to do that, or I want to be a mother and set aside my career for a decade, or whatever the case may be. You sometimes want to sort of armor yourself against having some of those more vulnerable conversations. And so, yeah, we do try to make space for that as well, because even though we're mostly terrible at it, work-life balance does matter, and figuring out how to be personally, emotionally fulfilled while you also do this work is really important. So yeah, I think that is one of the more important things about having that sort of closed, safe community space.
What is the personal fulfillment for you of doing this work?
I really think it's just seeing things that could be better and wanting to leave a better space behind me. There were all sorts of people who were good to me when I was starting out, who took a chance on me, who nurtured and mentored me early on in my career, and I try to do that for other photographers. And I also want to see these larger structural things change, because they impact not just us in the industry, they impact everyone who consumes our images. And again, I think it's such an incredible power and privilege to be a photojournalist. Our images have such reach. They are such a record of history. They have so much significance. And if they continue to be made in a one-note Western colonial male way, we're doing a disservice to ourselves, to future generations, if we're not telling a complete version of our own history. So I think that's, in both my own photographic work and in my advocacy work, I think that's really sort of the driving force.
I keep going back to this picture of you as a 19-year-old, and what have you learned about yourself, since then? Maybe something that you thought was true at the time that you've since learned is not.
I don't know. I don't think I've actually changed all that much as a person over the last 15 years or so, which may or may not be a good thing. I don't know. I think, whether it's a product of how I was raised or just my innate personality, I think one of the things that has served me well in doing this work is, I consider myself very lucky in that most of my projects at this point are grant funded, and that sort of allows me to be loud and speak up and say things that I think other freelancers wouldn't necessarily feel safe saying, because they want to be hired by editors and they don't want to be seen as rocking the boat too much. And I completely understand that. That's real. But I feel like I'm privileged in that sort of professional sense, that I exist in the space where I have a little more room to speak up. And I think I just have a very thick skin, and I recognize that I cannot make everyone happy, but as long as I am convinced that I am working in a good way and I am doing work that I think is right and just, and I have people I trust who can tell me, nope, you got that one wrong, fix it, do better. And I think that's the thing that has helped me keep going with a lot of these different kinds of projects, is just that it rolls off my back and I'm not particularly concerned by it. And I recognize you're never going to make everyone happy. So that didn't really answer your question. But I think that's probably the dominant personality trait.
I think it's interesting to be both an empath and to let things be able to roll off your, roll off your back, or to be able to not care. Because I think sometimes, it, I guess, and maybe that has to be the case, to be a working and surviving empath, evolving to the point of not letting everything, get to you, and letting go.
But I think those are also two very segregated spaces. I mean, I talk about the empathy, and I mean that very specifically with the people who trust me with their stories and the people who I spend my time documenting, versus working as an advocate in my industry, where very often people who are in positions of power relative to me at organizations I work for, people I respect, colleagues, are not convinced that I'm doing the right thing, don't believe in the work that I'm doing, think that they have a better answer for the work that I'm doing, whatever the case may be. And so it's sort of those interactions that I have to steel myself against a little more. But I think being able to just sort of let those go has served me well so far.
Can you give people, you've acknowledged that you are privileged and fortunate to have so much work be funded through grants. And so just for the people listening, like how, because I think that's a big and scary thing for a lot of people, and yet it's out there. So what advice can you give people in terms of how to seek funding for the work that people are doing?
Sure. So I think there is a lot of institutional nonprofit funding out there, from organizations like National Geographic Society to the Pulitzer Center to the International Women's Media Foundation to Open Society Foundations to Magnum Foundation. There are a lot of nonprofits looking to fund journalists because they know that newsrooms increasingly can't. And so I think, the most important thing is really being able to write well about your work and your intentions and what you're hoping to accomplish with your photography. And I know, I didn't study photography, so I don't have a ton of insight into formal photojournalism education. But I get the sense from some of the students I've spoken to that that's not always an emphasis. And I think something that we all should remember, and again, it depends how you want to work, and we all work in very different ways. But if you're looking for grant funding, which often is for more long-term work, I really do think it's important for us to think of ourselves as journalists first and foremost. Photography is the medium, and that's really important, and that's how we communicate. But we're journalists, and that means that we research statistics, and that we're combing through data, and we're looking at history and looking at all the work that came before us. And being able to incorporate that and sort of have this holistic understanding of a story, have an understanding of how your story in particular ties into broader global issues, have an understanding of why your project matters. I think those are some of the most important things that you can do when you're pitching yourself to an organization. And as someone who now reviews grant applications all the time, I think that's one of the weak points that I see often is people who don't sort of situate themselves in those ways.
And so going back to community and resources, we've talked about a number of places that can provide those people to talk to who have been successful in getting grants and knowing what doesn't work and what does work. Is that some of the places that you named, Women Photograph, do you provide that as well?
In terms of advice about...
Yeah,
absolutely. I think, again, it's one of my favorite parts of Women Photograph isn't any of our actual programming. It's the fact that we have a sort of private online community. And the amount, I think photojournalism in general can be an extremely competitive space. And that's understandable because, again, there's a limited number of assignments. There is not that much funding out there right now. It's hard. It's hard to survive and to establish yourself and to sustain yourself. And so there isn't always a reason to share resources and to help one another out, even though I believe that we only grow and benefit by doing that. But within the Women Photograph community, I have been astonished to see the ways in which people have volunteered time and energy and contacts and resources and send me your grant application and I'll edit it for you and I'll take a look at this edit if you want me to. That's honestly my favorite part. And so that's happening constantly. And, I try to do it myself, but more than anything, it's members reaching out to each other and helping each other out.
And so as kind of our time is running out, how can I've got Diane Alford who is saying, how can I find out more about or join? Like, again, remind us who Women Photograph, who are the members, what are the requirements, and how can people get involved?
Sure. So Women Photograph is a nonprofit and database of independent women and non-binary photographers. I believe right now we have about 1,050 members in about 110 countries around the world. The only real parameters for being a member is that you be a working professional for at least 5 years, that you identify as a woman or as non-binary, and that you be independent. So we don't have staffers or wire photographers. But beyond that, it's fairly open. We recently moved to an annual open call. So our next open call will be in December, and we'll have applications, and then we'll have a selection committee go through applications and take in new photographers. Yeah.
And I think just for people listening out there, there's, the thought of like, well, what does it mean to be working for 5 years, like as a, professionally or what have you? Which goes back around to, what does it mean to be a professional photographer? So what, for Women Photograph, what does that mean?
We allow people to self-identify. We don't demand proof. We're not looking for clips. If you say that you have been working professionally for 5 years, we trust you. So it's really whatever definition you use for your own career and those markers. Yeah. So it's very open.
Okay. Good to know, because it's, as a photographer myself, or a lot of people, like you said, in photojournalism, it's very hard to sustain as a full-time career. So I think a lot of people pursue personal projects or, as a way in, and then there's, how are you getting, and then there's getting paid as well.
Yeah, and we don't say anything like you have to sustain yourself off of photojournalism for 5 years, or it can be your only source of income, because, I think a lot of us, when we start out, have side hustles. I was a bartender for a long time in New York while I was also working as a photojournalist. And again, I think that's yet another one of those things that makes photojournalism remain a kind of classist space. So we don't have any preferences about income streams. We just, if you define your career as something that has been going for more than 5 years, then we're good with it.
Awesome. I'm wondering if there are any sort of final words for listeners out there in terms of just kind of the inspiration of, you've been able to keep going and keep going and keep going. And, it's kind of a cliche question to like, what would you tell yourself, when you were that 19-year-old, out there in the midst of men now, but this, I don't know, final words to share.
Oh, geez. I think it's just always trying to reorient and center your own moral compass in this industry about, whether it's the actual photography itself or the ways in which we're engaging with our colleagues or what we hope for the industry at large. It's hard to look at this business because it's something, it's kind of like my relationship with the United States. It's something that I love so deeply and care about so much, and also just see so many flaws and want it to be much, much better than it is. And so I think, all of us have a responsibility to make it a better space, to leave it better than we found it. And I think all of us have a responsibility to treat each other and the people we photograph and the people we work with and the people who hire us with as much dignity and respect and empathy as we possibly can. And I think it's easy to lose sight of those things, but if that can be our main takeaway, that would be great.
Well, you are certainly doing just that and more in the way of helping others do the same. And so I'm incredibly grateful for your time and sharing with us the work that you do and your personal stories and inspiration. So I want to make sure that everybody knows how to follow you, find you, and as a way to get to a lot of the places that we talked about today as well.
You can find me on both Instagram and Twitter at Zalcman, Dzalcman. The same for Women Photograph. It's at Women Photograph on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And then if you Google my name, Daniella Zalcman, it's easy to find my email. I'm always open. If students or early career photographers want to email me and chat, I try to make as much time for that as I can.
Amazing. In all of the time that we all have the same 24 hours in the day. Thank you again so much, Daniella, and thank you to everybody who has been tuning in. We've got Roya, who is tuning in from Tunisia, which I always love to see the different places from all over the world. So thank you again, and thank you for the incredible work that you do. And I want to say thank you again to everybody tuning in. You can see what is coming up next here on Creative Live TV by checking out the schedule if you're on creativelive.com/TV. And you can check out all of the past episodes of our We Are Photographers podcast on creativelive.com/podcast. So thank you again, everyone. And thank you again, Daniella. We'll see you all next time.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Chase Jarvis, founder and CEO of Creative Live. You all know that we have more than 2,000 classes and more than 10,000 hours of learning, inspirational, and motivational content on the platform. I'm super excited to announce a new experience on Creative Live. It's called Fast Class. You've told us that you're busy and sometimes it's hard to dive into a full class from start to finish. So essentially, we're now giving you a shortened highlight version of our top Creative Live classes. You can always dive into the full class with 5, 10, or 15 hours of great content. But now, if you're just looking to focus on a few of the highlights or want to be able to skip quickly to something that really interests you, you can now get a shortened fast class version of that class. We're also thinking this might be able to help you explore a new craft and save time while doing it. This is a great tool to curate your learning experience to help create the life that you seek. So you're probably thinking, great, how do I access this new experience on Creative Live? That's easy. All you have to do is be a subscriber to the Creator Pass, and then all this is yours. If you're feeling isolated and looking for creative connection, try tuning into creativelive.com/TV. That's where we've got a 24/7 live stream from the kitchen counters.
I can do that backlit shot that I really like to do.
From the studios and living rooms of many of the world's top creators, where we're doing musical performances, Q&As, cooking shows, virtual book tour events, drawing, spoken word poetry, and more.
Life passed me by waiting for an invitation when the world is greater than my nation or my occupation. Be someone you've never been. You feel all that adrenaline? It's medicine.
It actually helps me feel like my days are more purposeful.
I hope that out of this deep pain will come some collective growth.
Dive into Creative Live TV today.